The 18-inch guns of the Yamato rose from the horizon like the fingers of a dying giant, reaching toward heaven as 10,000 tons of steel and pride began its final descent into the dark waters of the East China Sea. I watched from the cockpit of my SB2C Helldiver, circling at 8,000 feet, as the last great battleship of the Imperial Japanese Navy rolled over and disappeared beneath the waves. The date was April 7, 1945, and I had just witnessed the end of an era. My name is Lieutenant Commander Jack Morrison, and I had been flying off the deck of the USS Bunker Hill for nearly 3 years by that spring morning. I'd seen Pearl Harbor's smoke still rising when we sailed west in '42. I'd dodged Zeros over the Marshalls and Marianas. I'd put bombs through the flight decks of Japanese carriers at the Philippine Sea. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for what we were about to face that April morning when the call came over the ship's intercom. All pilots to ready rooms. This is not a drill. The ready room buzzed with nervous energy as our squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Bill Hayes, stepped to the front. The cigarette smoke was thick enough to cut with a knife, and every man in that room knew something big was coming. Hayes was a veteran of Midway, a quiet man with steel-gray eyes who never wasted words. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice cutting through the chatter, "intelligence reports that the Japanese have sortied their remaining heavy units from the inland sea. The Yamato, the light cruiser Yahagi, and 8 destroyers are heading south toward Okinawa." A murmur ran through the room. Every pilot knew about the Yamato. She was a legend, the largest battleship ever built, with armor thicker than a man was tall and guns that could throw a shell the size of a small automobile over 20 miles. She was the pride of the Japanese fleet, a floating fortress that had haunted our nightmares since the war began. "This is it, boys," Hayes continued. "Operation 10 Go. Task Force 58 has been given the mission to find and destroy this force before it can reach the invasion fleet off Okinawa. We launch at 1,000 hours. I felt my stomach tighten. The Yamato wasn't just another ship. She was a symbol. For the Japanese, she represented their naval power, their Bushido spirit, their refusal to surrender. For us, she was the ultimate target, the whale we'd been hunting for years. As we filed out of the ready room, my wingman, Ensign Tommy Rodriguez, fell into step beside me. Tommy was 22, fresh-faced, and this would be his first major engagement. He joined the squadron just after we'd left Pearl Harbor for what would become our final push toward Japan. "You ever see anything like the Yamato before, Commander?" Tommy asked, his voice tight with nervous energy. I looked at him, remembering my own first real combat mission. "No, son, but I've seen plenty of ships that looked unsinkable go down. Steel is steel, and we've got the ordnance to punch through it." The truth was, I wasn't sure. The Yamato's armor was legendary, over 16 inches of steel plate protecting her vital areas. Her anti-aircraft guns numbered in the hundreds. She was designed to absorb punishment that would sink any other ship afloat. But we had advantages, too. We had numbers, we had coordination, and we had 3 years of combat experience that had taught us how to work together like a symphony of destruction. The flight deck of the Bunker Hill was organized chaos. Deck crews swarmed over the aircraft, loading bombs and torpedoes, checking engines, and fueling tanks. The smell of aviation gasoline mixed with salt air and the acrid smoke from the ship's stacks. I walked around my Helldiver, running my hands along the bomb bay doors, checking the control surfaces, performing the ritual that had kept me alive through dozens of missions. My bird was loaded with a single 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb. Around me, other pilots were climbing into their cockpits. Some carried torpedoes. Others had loads of smaller bombs designed to tear up the superstructure and knock out anti-aircraft guns. The plan was simple in concept, but complex in execution. Overwhelm the Japanese formation with waves of coordinated attacks. Hit them from multiple directions simultaneously, and don't let up until they were all on the bottom. At 1,000 hours, The first wave began launching. I watched as the torpedo bombers of VT-84 roared down the deck, their heavy fish slung beneath their bellies, followed by the fighters of VF-84 with their sleek F6F Hellcats. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar of engines pushing aircraft into the morning sky. My turn came 20 minutes later. I pushed the throttles forward and felt the familiar surge of power as the Wright R2600 engine responded. The Helldiver accelerated down the deck, and I pulled back on the stick as we reached the end. The ship fell away beneath us, and we were airborne, climbing into the brilliant Pacific morning. The rendezvous took place at 12,000 feet, 70 miles northwest of the task force. I looked around in amazement as aircraft from 8 different carriers formed up around us, over 380 planes in total. There were dive bombers like mine, torpedo planes with their deadly fish, and fighters to provide cover. It was the largest single airstrike of the Pacific War, and every one of us knew we were part of something historic. The flight north took an hour and a half. Below us, the Pacific stretched endlessly, a brilliant blue canvas broken only by the occasional white cap. I kept my eyes on the horizon, watching for the first glimpse of our target. The radio chattered with position reports and course corrections as our formation adjusted to the latest intelligence. At 12:45 hours, I heard the call I'd been waiting for. Tally-ho! Ships bearing 010 degrees, distance 20 miles. I strained my eyes forward and saw them, dark shapes on the horizon, moving south in a neat formation. Even from this distance, the Yamato stood out. She was massive, dwarfing the other ships around her like a cathedral surrounded by houses. Her pagoda-style superstructure rose in tiers, bristling with guns and radar antennae. Behind her came the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, their wakes cutting white lines through the blue water. "All right, people," came the voice of the strike coordinator, Commander Jim Rasmussen from the Yorktown. "This is what we came for. Remember your assignments. Torpedo planes go in first, hit them low and slow. Dive bombers follow 30 seconds later. Fighters, keep those flak guns busy. Let's make this one count." My heart was pounding as we began our approach. The Japanese had seen us coming. I could see the ships beginning to turn, their anti-aircraft guns swinging skyward. The Yamato's massive turrets were also moving, and I realized with a chill that they were going to try to use their main guns against us. I'd heard stories of Japanese battleships firing Sanchikidan, special anti-aircraft shells that burst in the air like giant shotguns, but I'd never seen it myself. The first torpedo attack went in at 12:45 hours. I watched from above as the TBF Avengers of VT-9 from the Yorktown swept in low over the water, their torpedoes aimed at the Yamato's massive hull. The Japanese response was immediate and devastating. Every gun on every ship opened fire simultaneously, filling the air with a solid wall of flak. The water around the attackers erupted in towering columns of spray as the battleship's main guns fired their Sanchikidan shells. 2 of the torpedo planes were hit immediately, cartwheeling into the sea in balls of flame. But the others pressed on, dropping their fish at point-blank range before pulling up and racing for safety. I saw at least 3 torpedoes running straight and true toward the Yamato's port side. The first torpedo hit just forward of the bridge, sending a column of water and smoke hundreds of feet into the air. The second struck amidships, and the third hit near the stern. The great ship shuddered under the impact, listing slightly to port, but she kept moving. Her armor was holding. "Dive bombers, you're up," came the call over the radio. "Hit her while she's hurt." I pushed the stick forward and felt the familiar sensation of the dive beginning. The Helldiver responded beautifully, dropping toward the Yamato like a stone. Around me, 30 other dive bombers were doing the same thing, creating a deadly rain of steel and explosives falling from the sky. The Japanese gunners were ready for us, the air filled with black puffs of anti-aircraft fire, and I could hear the metallic pings of shrapnel hitting my aircraft. A plane to my left took a direct hit and simply disappeared, vaporized in a ball of orange flame. Another pilot's voice came over the radio, calm and professional. "I'm hit bad, going in anyway." I held my dive steady, watching the Yamato grow larger and larger in my bomb sight. She was trying to turn to avoid us, but her massive size worked against her. At 2,500 feet, I pickled my bomb and pulled out off the dive, feeling the G-forces slam me back into my seat. Behind me, the 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb fell toward its target. The explosion was tremendous. My bomb, along with several others, struck the Yamato's superstructure and forward deck. I looked back to see fires erupting from her pagoda mast and smoke pouring from her forward gun turrets. But she was still afloat, still fighting, still dangerous. The second wave came in 20 minutes later, more torpedo planes, more dive bombers, more fighters strafing her decks. I watched from a safe distance as the attacks continued, wave after wave of American aircraft hammering the Japanese formation. The destroyers were taking a beating too. I saw one of them, the Hamikaze, suddenly heel over and begin to sink, her back broken by a direct hit from a 1,000-pound bomb. But it was the Yamato that held our attention. She was like a wounded animal, lashing out with everything she had. Her anti-aircraft fire never slackened, even as bombs exploded on her decks and torpedoes tore into her hull. I counted at least 8 torpedo hits on her port side, and her list was becoming more pronounced with each passing minute. The third wave was the decisive one. Commander Rasmussen coordinated the attack perfectly, hitting the Yamato from 3 different directions simultaneously. I watched as torpedo planes came in from the starboard side while dive bombers attacked from directly overhead and fighters strafed her superstructure to suppress the flak guns. This time, the damage was catastrophic. I saw a torpedo hit right at the waterline, followed immediately by a massive secondary explosion that sent a column of fire shooting up from her hull. Her forward magazines had been hit. The great ship lurched to port, her list increasing dramatically. "She's going," somebody shouted over the radio. "The Yamato's going down." I circled overhead, watching in fascination and horror as the death of the Yamato unfolded below me. Her list continued to increase, 30 degrees, 40 degrees, 50 degrees. Men were jumping from her decks, tiny figures disappearing into the churning water. Her massive guns, which had once been pointed defiantly at the sky, now pointed uselessly at the ocean. At 14:20 hours, the end came suddenly. The Yamato rolled completely over, her red bottom paint visible for just a moment before she began her final plunge. Then came the explosion, a blast so tremendous that we felt the shock wave at 8,000 feet. Her magazines went up all at once, creating a fireball that rose nearly 2 miles into the sky. The sound was like the end of the world. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but debris and oil slick. The Yamato, all 72,000 tons of her, had simply vanished. With her went 2,498 of her crew, including Admiral Seiichi Ito, who had commanded the operation. The pride of the Japanese fleet was gone, erased from the ocean in less than 2 hours of concentrated attack. The light cruiser Yahagi followed her flagship to the bottom 20 minutes later, overwhelmed by torpedo and bomb hits. Of the 8 destroyers that had started the mission, only 4 made it back to Japan, and all of them were damaged. The Japanese had lost nearly 4,000 men in the engagement. On our side, we lost 10 aircraft and 12 men, a remarkably light toll for such a massive operation. As we formed up for the flight back to the task force, I couldn't help but reflect on what we had just accomplished. We had destroyed the most powerful warship ever built, along with most of her escorts. We had proven that the age of the battleship was over, that air power was now supreme on the seas. But more than that, we had delivered a blow to Japanese morale that would echo all the way to Tokyo. The flight back was quiet, each pilot lost in his own thoughts. Tommy Rodriguez pulled up alongside me, his Helldiver showing several holes from flak fragments. He gave me a thumbs up, and I could see the grin on his face even through his oxygen mask. He was no longer the nervous young ensign who had asked me about the Yamato that morning. He was a veteran now, baptized in the fire of combat. As we approached the task force, I could see the signal lights flashing from the carriers, already preparing for our landing. The deck crews would be waiting, ready to service our aircraft for the next mission. Because there would be a next mission, and another after that, until this terrible war was finally over. Landing aboard the Bunker Hill was routine, a controlled crash onto the deck, the arresting wire bringing us to a jarring stop. As I climbed out of my cockpit, the deck crew chief, Chief Petty Officer Mike Sullivan, was waiting for me. "How'd it go, Commander?" he asked, his weathered face showing the strain of 3 years of war. "We got her, Chief," I replied, pulling off my flight helmet. "The Yamato's gone." "They're all gone." Sullivan nodded grimly. He'd been in the Navy for 15 years, and he understood what this meant. "Good," he said simply. "Maybe this thing will be over soon." That evening, as I sat in my stateroom writing my after-action report, I thought about the men who had died that day. The Japanese sailors who had gone down with their ships had been brave men, fighting for their country just as we were fighting for ours. They had followed their orders to the end, even when those orders meant certain death. But I also thought about the American boys who would not die on the beaches of Okinawa because the Yamato would not be there to shell them. I thought about the invasion of Japan itself still months away, and how many lives might be saved because the Japanese fleet was no longer a threat. The war was not over. It would continue for another 4 months until the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But April 7, 1945, marked the end of Japanese naval power. With the Yamato gone, the Imperial Navy was finished as an effective fighting force. The last great surface action of the Pacific War was over. As I finished my report and prepared for bed, I could hear the sound of aircraft engines from the flight deck above. Night fighters were being launched, maintaining the combat air patrol that protected our task force. The war went on, but we had won a great victory that day. Years later, when people asked me about the war, they often wanted to know about the big battles, Midway, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf. But for me, the destruction of the Yamato was the moment when I knew we had truly won. Not just the battle, but the war itself. The Japanese had sent their greatest ship on a suicide mission, and we had sent her to the bottom with barely a scratch on our own forces. It was a demonstration of American industrial might, tactical skill, and sheer determination. We had built more ships, trained more pilots, and developed better tactics than our enemies. We had learned from our mistakes at Pearl Harbor and had forged ourselves into the most powerful naval force in the history of the world. The Yamato had been a symbol of Japanese naval pride, a monument to their engineering skill and military tradition. But symbols cannot fight wars, men do. And on that April morning in 1945, American airmen had proven that courage, skill, and overwhelming force could overcome any challenge. The last sortie of the Yamato was also the last gasp of the Imperial Japanese Navy. With her death came the end of an era, and the beginning of American dominance of the Pacific that would last for generations. We had fought our way across thousands of miles of ocean, from the coral atolls of the Central Pacific to the very doorstep of Japan itself. The cost had been terrible, thousands of American lives lost, billions of dollars spent, families torn apart by war. But we had prevailed. We had faced an enemy that preferred death to surrender, that would ram their aircraft into our ships rather than admit defeat, that would send their greatest warship on a one-way mission to glory. And we had won. As I drifted off to sleep that night, listening to the steady drone of the ship's engines and the distant sound of aircraft returning from patrol, I knew that I had been part of something historic. We had witnessed the end of the age of battleships and the beginning of the age of aircraft carriers. We had seen the last great naval battle in the traditional sense, fought between surface ships and attacking aircraft. Most importantly, we had proven that American democracy, American industry, and American fighting spirit could overcome any challenge. The young men who had died at Pearl Harbor had been avenged. The Marines who had stormed the beaches of Tarawa and Saipan had been vindicated. The sailors who had fought at Guadalcanal and the Philippine Sea had been rewarded. The Yamato was gone, and with her went the last hope of the Japanese Empire. The war would continue, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. We had broken the back of Japanese naval power, and now nothing stood between us and final victory. In the distance, I could hear the sound of reveille being blown on another ship. Soon it would bid on, and there would be another day of war. But for now, in the darkness of my stateroom, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. We had done our job. We had served our country, and we had won. The death of the Yamato was more than just the sinking of a ship. It was the end of an empire's dreams and the validation of a democracy's strength. As I finally fell asleep, I knew that whatever came next, we would be ready. We were Americans, and we had proven that we could not be defeated. The last sortie was over. The final victory was yet to come.